I'd like this morning to reflect on our gospel reading, and thanks Dorothy for bringing that to us. And our gospel reading this morning is really all about prayer. And prayer, I think, is a really interesting topic. It's a topic that creates a lot of discussion. It's a topic that creates and leads to people expressing some really strong feelings as well. Did you know that unanswered prayer is actually listed as one of the top reasons that people walk away from the Christian faith? And there's lots of questions around prayer. When, how, why, what's the point of praying? And I'm sure all of those questions were front and mind for Jesus' followers when they asked him the question, how do we pray? Teach us how to pray. And I think the good news for us this morning is that Jesus gives us some really solid tips on how we should approach prayer. And that's partly what I'd like to look at this morning. And in particular, there's two things that I want to pick up on. There's lots that could be said, but there's two things in particular that I want to pick up on when it comes to how we should pray. First thing that I think that comes out, particularly for me, is to note that we should pray. Jesus prayed regularly. Jesus prayed regularly, and so we should too. Jesus made praying a regular part of his daily routine, a regular discipline. Now, if you're anything like me, when you hear the words prayer and discipline, you get a bit of a cold shudder. I do, because I straight away think, oh, here we go. I've tried so many times to be disciplined in my prayer, and I always fail. I already feel really busy, and the thought of adding another discipline to my plate makes me break out into a cold sweat. So straight away, that's how I start to think. Maybe you start to think like that as well, because I'm actually not that good at discipline, really. I'm one of those people, I'm ashamed to say, that has taken out a gym membership and not really used it. Is there anyone else in this room that's done that? We're not going to admit to it. But you know, I actually read that gyms rely on people like me, because what they do is they make money by oversubscribing their membership. So if everyone who took out a membership actually went to the gym, it'd be too crowded. But they know that there's lots of people like me out there who'll take up the membership and then not actually use it. I can play guitar, I can play chords and sing along and things like that, but I would love to be a really good lead guitarist. I would love to be able to do that. And at one point in my life I pursued that. I had some lessons, but I'm not actually a lead guitarist, and there's a reason for that. It's because I didn't practice. I didn't regularly do what I was meant to do. And the thing is, if playing lead guitar or being good at the organ for that matter, if it was easy, we'd all be good at it. But things like that require discipline, they require effort. And we see the same thing in sport, maybe the profession we're involved in. To do well, to get good at what we do requires effort, it requires discipline. And I actually think that prayer, connecting with God, is a lot like that too, unfortunately. It'd be nice if there was a shortcut. I've tried to find one, but I can't. If we want a depth of relationship, if we want a real connection with God, then we actually need to put in the effort. Because I think depth of relationship and connection with God actually really only comes through prayer. If Jesus felt the need to pray regularly, it's probably important that we do too. I was having a conversation with someone recently in our community cafe in the Link, and we were talking about how in our relationships, and I was talking in the context of being a father, so I have three kids, and I was saying that I've found in my relationship with my kids, the quality interactions come through quantity interactions. So, for example, when we were living down south, my oldest son Tom, when he was going through high school and didn't have his licence, he loved surfing, so I used to drive him at least once or twice a week for a surf, and it was about a half-hour drive there and a half-hour drive back. Sometimes on those drives, we would have great conversations. We would talk about really deep and important things, and it helped us to really connect. Other times, we might just talk footy or not talk much at all. It depended, but my point is the quality came through the quantity. I always laugh a bit when people talk about getting their lives in order, and it's almost like some parents will pencil in, well, I've got 45 minutes there, I'm going to have some quality time with my kids. And I think, well, Maybe, but maybe they're not having a good day, or maybe you're not having a good day, and that's not going to be quality time. Quality comes through quantity, and I think our connection with God is like that as well. We need to put in time and effort. It's a bit like pounding for gold, and then sometimes you get those gold moments, those gold connections, but they don't come if the quantity time is not there. I think connecting with God is like any relationship. Quality comes through quantity. So there is a discipline. There is an earnestness involved that there's just no way around. Jesus saw the need to make it a discipline. And so I think we're being told today that we need to do the same. I think another really important thing to note from Jesus' teaching on prayer is that Jesus doesn't treat God like some kind of genie who's there to do his bidding. I think the phrase, "your will be done," is key. Your will be done. When we pray, what we ask for needs to be in line with the will of God. It needs to be in line with God's plans, God's purposes, God's design for us and for the world around us. What we pray needs to be in line with the will of God, and it kind of goes in a loop, because the more time we spend in the presence of God, the more aligned we get with the will of God. God is not a genie there to do our bidding. We pray in line with the will of God. And we also need to recognise, and I think this is really important, that line, and as we look at the broader version of the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We need to recognise that line for what it is. It's actually a call to action. It's not just pious words, it's a call to action. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What is the will of God for the world around us? Once we know what that is, then we're actually called to help that become a reality. So this prayer is actually a call to action as well. So I think in terms of a couple of key things that jumped out for me that we can take, and there's so much to be said. As you look at the Lord's Prayer, as you go through it, there's so many different sections, and each one is a sermon in itself. So it's a whole series. So I would encourage you this week to go home, reflect on the Lord's Prayer, do some reading around it, and to hear what God is saying to you about it. But I also wanted to spend just a little bit of time looking at the last part of that reading, because it's a really interesting story. It's the bit where the man gets a late night visitor who comes to his home, and he panics a bit because he doesn't have any bread. And you need to understand that at that particular time and in that particular place, hospitality was a sacred duty. That's why he doesn't just go, well, yep, come into my house and wait for the morning and I'll get you some food. The markets are closed, he doesn't have any bread, and so what does he do? He goes next door to his neighbour's house and he bangs on the door and says, I need to get some bread. I've got a visitor, I need to feed them. And his neighbour says, well, it's late, we're all in bed, come back tomorrow and I'll give you some bread. But he keeps on banging on the door, and eventually the neighbour gets up and he's a bit grumpy. You can imagine his wife saying, I'll just go and give him what he wants to get him away so we can go back to sleep. And he gets up and he gives the man some bread, and away he goes. I think it's a really interesting story, and it's one that needs some comment. And one of the things I want to say about it is that God is not the grumpy neighbour in the story who will give us what we want if we annoy him enough and can make him angry enough to go, oh, okay. That's not who God is in the story. It's true that in many parables there is a God figure. An obvious example would be the prodigal son. The father in the prodigal son is showing us an example and an element of God's character and what God is like. But that, I don't believe, is the case here. We're not being told that God is hard of hearing or will angrily give in if we nag him enough. That's not the point of this story. Parables always have a particular point, and I think at the core of this parable, it's really all about persistence. It's telling us that we need to hang in there if we desire real and strong connection with God. We need to be disciplined. We need to show an earnestness in seeking after that. We also need to hang in there in our desire to see the world become the place that God created it to be. We need persistence. to not just give up when things don't go the way we want them to or think they should. We need to hang in there. This parable at its core is about persistence, hanging in there. I think it's also true that sometimes it's in the waiting that our connection with God really has the chance to grow in deeper and more intimate ways. Sometimes it's in the waiting that our deeper connection with God is forged. It's also true that sometimes in the waiting we begin to realise that maybe what we're asking for isn't actually in line with God's will. I think most of us would say that a meaningful prayer life is something that we want. But in reality, how many of us are prepared to put in the hard yards to help it become a reality? And I have to say, very often, I'm not prepared to do that. How persistent are we in developing, fostering the disciplines that develop deep connection with God? So spending time with God, praying, talking, worship, gathering with other believers. How much time are we prepared to put in to those things to foster that connection with God? So I think in many ways, the story at the end of our reading this morning doesn't so much tell us about God, but about us. I think it holds up a mirror to us. It certainly does to me. This parable is not about God being a grumpy old man. No, it's about us. It's about me not being earnest enough, not being persistent enough in seeking the things of God. And I have to say that I've tried many times to be earnest when it comes to connecting with God, but I often give up. I'm good for a while and then I give up. The disciplines fade away. But I believe that this passage encourages and challenges me to be more persistent, to be more tenacious in seeking connection with and the things of God. This challenge is a parable and an encouragement to me to persist, to hang in there. I think the concept of prayer as struggle is a completely foreign one to many of us. We pray and when things don't pan out the way we think they should or quickly like that, we give up. I think it's the same when it comes to working for God's purposes in the world. We have a bit of a go, and then when things don't turn out quickly or the way we think they should straight away, we give up. This passage this morning is encouraging us to hang in there, to persist. To persist. And the final thing that I'd like to say is please don't mishear me. I'm not saying for a moment if you have unanswered prayer in your life, I'm not saying for a moment it's because you haven't been faithful enough or because you haven't been persistent enough. The last thing I want to do is heap any more pain on something you've experienced there. And I've got a few thoughts but no real answer as to why sometimes prayers are answered and sometimes they aren't. I think there are multiple factors. Many of them are actually out of our control. So I'm not suggesting this morning, and I don't want you to walk away hearing, oh, Andy said if I haven't got in my life what I wanted, it's because I haven't been faithful enough or I haven't prayed enough. That's not what I'm saying this morning. I think at the end of the day, this passage is a reminder to us that prayer is important. It's vital to a deep and meaningful connection with God. And it's vital to actually spurring us into action, because it's as we spend time with God that we are shaped from within. It changes our perspective on the world. It changes our attitudes. It changes our values. And it spurs us into action. Prayer is vital for our connection with God, for our well-being, for becoming the people God created us to be, and for doing God's work in the world. Prayer is vital for that. And we're being reminded this morning, I think, that like anything in this life that's worthwhile, it requires time and it requires effort. And I hope we hear it as much an encouragement as a challenge. I'd just like to leave a little bit of silence now for you to hear what God might be saying to you by God's Spirit through the Bible reading, through what I've shared, and then I'll pray at the end of that silence. So just a bit of silence now.